Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the next part of our second lecture in this introduction to phonology. We've just talked about some reasons for believing that the entities that we can discover through the procedures of phonemic analysis can indeed be thought to have psychological reality for the speakers of those languages. And now what I'd like to do is to briefly introduce a concept that will come to have a great deal of importance later in this course, namely the notion of rule ordering. So back in lecture 1, when we discussed the process of n-dentalization in English, I briefly mentioned in the illustrative derivation there that there could be multiple rules at work. So for instance, in the word month, there we needed to have the rule of n-dentalization, and suggested, we could have a second rule here, and we would need to pay attention to the order in which these rules apply. So I want to make this explicit here, and the reason why we have to be aware of this, the arrangement, the ordering from top to bottom, so to say, of these rules, is that when you uncover multiple phonological rules, there's the potential for the rules to interact, to play with one another, so to say. In particular, we'll see instances later in the course in which one process might create or remove the conditions for the application of another process. And under such conditions, it's really necessary that the two rules be crucially ordered. Generating the data that we are then attempting to account for through phonological analysis will require that one rule come first and the other rule apply after it. Mm-hmm. And these topics, process interaction and rule ordering, will be a major theme later in this course. For today's purposes, I just want to illustrate this principle that rules can crucially interact, because we might occasionally encounter some such circumstances in exercises that will work out together, or it might come up in homework exercises before I have the opportunity to explain rule ordering and process interaction in great detail. So the data here you can find in your textbook on page 45 from the Lango language, which is a Nilotic language spoken in Uganda. And here I simply show you all of this data. We're actually not going to work through all of the data. We're not going to carry out a phonemic analysis in detail here. I only want to discuss the part that is relevant in terms of rule ordering. You can try to work out the phonemic analysis yourself at home. So the analysis that is the case in this language is that we can take the Lango language to have 3 stop phonemes, each corresponding to a voiceless stop at the labial, alveolar, and velar places of articulation. And each of these stop phonemes has 2 allophones, a continuant and a stop. So for instance, the labial phoneme has a voiceless labial stop and a voiceless bilabial fricative. The velar stop has a velar fricative and a voiced velar fricative. These continuant allophones are found between vowels. So for instance, if we look at the beginning of a few words in this language, we have words like he and tong with a stop at the beginning of a word, whereas we have kal with a stop at the beginning of a word, but on the other hand, we have words like pafo with a fricative in between vowels, or let's see if I can spot another example with a velar fricative on the page. Daho with a velar fricative there between vowels. Now, since the stops occur in a wider variety of environments, they constitute the else or allophone. That's why we've chosen the stop as the underlying representation for the phoneme. And in principle, what one could do in deriving each of these allophones, each of these continuant allophones. Should note here, this sound, this is a voiceless alveolar tap. You may not be able to hear that very well at home, but it's the same sound as in English, in the middle of the English word butter, that tap that we've referred to a few times today, only voiceless rather than voiced. Now, for deriving each of these three allophones, each of these three continuant allophones, you could, of course, write three separate rules, which maps the underlying phoneme, p, t, k, onto the respective allophone, f, r, h. What should stand out to you from the beginning is that this bilabial fricative and this velar fricative, they are clearly unproblematically the corresponding expected fricatives at the same place of articulation as the stops. So we could easily derive those fricatives using only a single phonological rule. We can call this rule spirantization, since we're transforming a stop into a fricative, and a rule states that a stop becomes a fricative when it occurs between two vowels. We'll look at some phonological derivations farther on, but let's just quickly show one case. We had the word pafo here, the word for father. So that should underlyingly, I'll add the tone symbols here as well. Here's our underlying representation of the word for father through our rule of spirantization. This P, which occurs between two vowels, will be transformed into a fricative. Can't quite remember the key combination for inputting the sign, and it's 278. For the voiceless bilabial fricative, and that rule gives us our expected allophone. Now, the issue here is that this rule of spirantization would perhaps generate an alveolar fricative from an underlying alveolar stop. Now, in dealing with this sound, this isn't just a fricative, this is an approximant. So it needs to be further transformed in some way. If we just say that an underlying t is going to become a fricative, it won't be able to generate this sound. So if we want to try to generate this sound of this alveolar tap, what we could do is we have two options, essentially. We could write a rule which transforms the underlying alveolar stop into the voiceless alveolar tap before the spirantization rule could transform it into a fricative, or we could take the output from the spirantization rule that would generate an alveolar fricative and transform that further into this alveolar tap. One important thing to note here is that, and this will become clear when we look more at phonological features next week, is that there is actually no fricative directly corresponding to an alveolar stop. The closest thing would perhaps be a sibilant fricative like s, but that in the feature system that we will learn about next week would require changing some additional features, not simply transforming a stop into a fricative. So let's assume then, because precisely of this problem, let's assume that Lango has no alveolar fricative because an underlying alveolar stop is first transformed into a voiceless alveolar tap. So we can write this further rule shown in 16 here. This takes a voiceless alveolar stop and it transforms it into a tap when it occurs between two vowels. We can see then that these two rules written in 15, spirantization, and 16, tapping, occur in the same context and they target similar sounds, but spirantization is written more generally so that it would be able to apply to more sounds, whereas tapping applies specifically only to alveolar sounds. It will only be able to apply to the underlying voiceless alveolar stop, t. So in this way, we can take a few illustrative derivations of the words for snow, collect, lion, and mountain to see the interaction of spirantization and tapping. So here, by having tapping ordered first from the underlying representation of the word for lion, which contains that alveolar stop, voiceless alveolar stop, that will be transformed into this voiceless alveolar tap. Tapping can't apply to any other underlying forms. Tapping doesn't apply to the voiceless alveolar stop here because it doesn't stand between two vowels. It's at the end of the word. Then our spirantization rule finds this voiceless labial stop and transforms it into a voiceless bilabial fricative and thereby we derive the correct form. Spirantization doesn't apply to the stop here in the word for snow because it stands at the beginning of a word. Let's think now for a moment what would happen if spirantization applied in the reverse order. And in particular, let's consider the word for lion here. If we had spirantization applying first, some other sound, I'll mark this sound with a question mark here because, as I mentioned above, there's no non-sibilant alveolar fricative. So the application of the spirantization rule, which would change a stop into a fricative, would create some other sound, and then tapping would no longer be able to apply because now we would have a fricative here instead. And what this rule actually, the ordering that we've adopted here of tapping applying before spirantization, it prevents spirantization from applying to this underlying stop. Because tapping creates, our tapping rule in 16 creates a tap out of this underlying voiceless alveolar stop, there's no longer then a stop in this word when the spirantization process attempts to apply. And this is why after tapping applies, we obtain this form. So the ultimate lesson, and the point here, is that the assumption that I'm making here, remember I stated here as one possible solution to this problem, you could simply write one rule corresponding to each of these three phonemes. So we could have written three rules, a rule which says that ta becomes a rule which says that ta becomes the tap, voiceless alveolar tap, and the velar fricative, the velar stop becomes corresponding velar fricative. These three rules, which all share the same environment, it would be possible to explain the facts of the language in this way. But doing so would appear to miss a generalization, namely that all three of these languages, all three of these allophones share the same environment. And in fact, there are some other technical options we could use to just use a single rule. I think later in the course we'll introduce some more complicated ways of writing rules so that we could use only a single rule in this case. But for present purposes, this helps us see how rule ordering is relevant. And the theoretical premise here is simply that fewer rules are better than more rules. Whenever we can explain more of the facts of the language using fewer phonological processes, this will be preferred. But when we want to try to work with fewer rules, we have to try to pay attention to the potential interactions between the rules. Okay, to wrap up today, we're going to come back to one last topic in just 1 minute. So let's take a little break for now. And then we'll talk about contextually limited contrast.